The sunlight shone like broken gold on the endless sea, sparkling and reflecting like countless bright gems. My wife and I boarded a luxury passenger ship and set off on the long-awaited sea voyage. This trip was supposed to be a romantic interlude in our marriage, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of the world and enjoy some quality time together. My wife was wearing a white dress, the light fabric of which fluttered in the sea breeze like the waves. Her slender waist was barely a handful, and in the sunlight she looked like a fairy from a dream. Her blonde hair fell like a waterfall over her shoulders, flying wildly in the wind and shimmering with golden light. Her blue eyes were like the deep sea, clear and charming, as if hiding endless secrets and tenderness. Her skin was as white as snow, tinged with a light blush, and her delicate features were like carefully crafted works of art. With a high, straight nose and small lips, every part just right. I held my wife's hand tightly, feeling the warmth of her palm, and my heart was full of happiness. We stood on the deck, facing the sea breeze, and admired the beautiful sea view. Occasionally, a few seagulls flew across the distant sea surface, and their cheerful cries echoed in the air. The passenger ship slowly sailed, leaving a long trail of white waves behind it. However, this tranquility did not last long. Suddenly, the lookout gave a shrill alarm. "Pirates!" I looked in the direction the lookout was pointing and saw a black pirate ship rapidly approaching us. The sail of the ship had a huge skull and crossbones logo printed on it, which looked particularly eerie as it flapped in the wind. As the pirate ship drew closer, I could see what it looked like. The hull was dilapidated, the planks covered in the marks of time and exuding a rotten smell. On the deck stood a group of pirates in strange costumes, armed with all kinds of weapons and with fierce expressions on their faces. At the bow of the ship stood a man wearing a black cloak, his figure looking particularly tall in the wind. Despite his skeleton appearance, he exuded a mysterious and powerful aura. As the skeleton pirate ship approached our passenger ship, the pirates on board began to shout. Their voices echoed across the sea, full of threats and provocations. My wife snuggled up close to me, her body trembling slightly, a hint of fear in her eyes. I gently patted her hand and reassured her, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." Just then, the skeleton pirate first mate in a black cloak walked up to us. His steps were steady, as if he were stepping on people's hearts with each step. He scanned the passenger ship with his eyes, and finally settled on my wife. A strange light flashed in his eyes, and it made my heart tighten. I subconsciously protected my wife behind me and watched him warily. "Beautiful lady," the skeleton pirate first mate said, his voice low and full of magnetism. "It is truly an honor to meet such a beautiful person on this vast sea." There was a hint of ambiguity in his words, which made me feel a burst of anger. My wife's face flushed slightly. She hid behind me and whispered, "Thank you, but please don't come near us." I could feel her tension and unease, and my dislike for the skeleton pirate first mate grew even more. The skeleton pirate first mate didn't care about our rejection. He smiled slightly, and that smile looked particularly eerie on his skeleton-like face. "Lady, don't be afraid. I don't mean any harm," he said. "I just want to be friends with you." I couldn't help but say, "We don't need your so-called friends. You pirates had better stay away from us." My voice carried a hint of anger and determination. The first mate of the skull pirate turned to me, his eyes flashing with disdain. "Humph, you coward, who are you to talk to me?" he said. "No one can stop me from the woman I like." Hearing his words, the anger in my heart could no longer be suppressed. I was about to rush up to argue with him, but was stopped by my wife. "Don't be impulsive," she whispered. "We are no match for them right now." I suppressed the anger in my heart, looked at the first mate of the skull pirate, and secretly vowed to protect my wife from harm. The first mate of the skull pirate did not take immediate action. He just stood at the bow of the ship, quietly watching us. His eyes were full of provocation and desire, as if declaring to me that he would definitely get my wife. And I, too, secretly made up my mind that no matter what the cost, I would protect our love and not let the skeleton pirate captain get his way. This encounter at sea seemed to be an arrangement of fate, and an unknown crisis and emotional entanglement was quietly beginning. In the following days, the Skull pirate ship kept following our passenger ship. They didn't attack, but the feeling of being watched made everyone feel extremely oppressed. My wife and I returned to our cabin. My wife sat by the bed, her eyes staring blankly out the window. I walked over to her and gently put my arm around her shoulders. "Don't worry, they won't do anything to us," I said, trying to reassure her. My wife nodded slightly, but I could feel that her heart was still full of fear and unease. "I just didn't think that our trip would turn out like this," she said, her voice a little choked with emotion. I held her tightly in my arms and comforted her gently. "Everything will be fine, and we'll go home safely," I said. However, I also knew in my heart that things were not as simple as I thought. The way the skeleton pirate first mate looked at my wife made me feel a deep sense of threat. I didn't know what he would do next, but I knew I had to stay vigilant at all times to protect my wife. At night, the lights on the passenger ship looked particularly weak on the dark sea. I lay in bed, but I couldn't sleep at all. I looked out the window at the dark sea, my heart full of worry. Suddenly, I heard a light sound of footsteps. I immediately became alert, quietly got up, and picked up a self-defense weapon that was placed by the bed. I opened the door quietly and looked out into the hallway. I saw a figure approaching our room. I was shocked. Could it be a pirate? I gripped the weapon in my hand tightly, ready to deal with any danger. As the figure drew closer, I realized it was my wife. She was wearing a thin nightshirt and her eyes were full of fear and confusion. "Why are you up?" I asked softly. My wife let out a sigh of relief when she saw me. "I had a nightmare that the skeleton pirate first mate was taking me away," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I hugged her and reassured her. "Don't be afraid. It was just a dream. I will always be by your side to protect you." My wife clung to me as if seeking a sense of security. We returned to our room, and my wife lay down on the bed while I sat by her side, guarding her. As I looked at her peaceful sleeping face, I secretly vowed that no matter what difficulties we encountered, I would never let anyone hurt her. However, fate did not seem to intend to let us off the hook. The next morning, when we went out on deck again, we found that the Skull pirate ship was even closer to us. The first mate of the Skull pirate ship was standing at the bow of the ship, and his gaze was still fixed on my wife. A greater crisis seemed to be approaching us step by step. Since our encounter with the skeleton pirate ship, the Erie vessel has been following our passenger ship like a ghost. The atmosphere on board has become increasingly oppressive, and the passengers are all worried, whispering about the dangers that may lie ahead. My wife, too, is enveloped in an invisible fear, and she has become even more reticent. Over the next few days, I noticed that my wife often looked unconsciously in the direction of the pirate ship, with a complex look in her eyes, which contained both fear and a trace of elusive curiosity. Whenever she did this, I would gently hold her hand to try to draw her attention back to me, but she always gave me a forced smile. One afternoon, the sun baked the deck and the sea breeze became a little hot. My wife was wearing a light blue chiffon blouse with white wide-leg pants. Her long hair was casually draped over her shoulders, and a few strands were soaked with sweat and stuck to her fair cheeks. Her figure looked even more graceful in this outfit, and her slender ankles were faintly visible in the breeze. The sandals on her feet shimmered with a silvery radiance. I accompanied her on a walk on the deck. Her pace was a little slow, and her eyes couldn't help but drift to the pirate ship in the distance. Just then, I heard a whoosh, and a black object flew over from the direction of the pirate ship and landed directly at our feet. I was startled and instinctively shielded my wife behind me, watching the object warily. It turned out to be a black rose with petals that had a strange luster, as if they had been dipped in ink. There was a note tied to the stem of the rose, with crooked handwriting that read, "For the most beautiful you." My wife's face instantly turned red, and a flash of panic crossed her eyes, along with an unmistakable gleam of joy. "Who did this?" I said angrily, reaching out to pick up the rose. But my wife got there first, holding the rose in her hands. Her fingers gently stroked the petals, and a look of tenderness came into her eyes. "Don't be like that. It's just a flower," she whispered, her voice shaking a little. I looked at her and a strong sense of unease welled up in me. "How can you accept something from a pirate? Have you forgotten their threats?" I asked. My wife's eyes flashed with indignation, and she lowered her head and whispered, "I just think the flower is beautiful, and besides, he hasn't done anything to harm us." I looked at her and my anger flared up, but seeing the tears in her eyes, I didn't want to scold her. From then on, my wife became a little strange. She often stood alone on the deck, staring into space, her black rose clutched tightly in her hand. The fear in her eyes of the skeleton pirate first mate seemed to be slowly diminishing, replaced by a strange kind of attention. One time, I saw her in the corner of the deck, looking in the direction of the pirate ship. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, revealing a faint smile. That smile made me feel incredibly strange. I quietly walked up behind her and asked softly, "What are you thinking?" She snapped back to reality, her smile instantly disappearing, and a flash of panic in her eyes. "No, nothing," she stammered. My unease grew stronger and stronger, and I decided to find an opportunity to have a good talk with her. That night, we returned to our cabin. I sat by the bed as she removed her makeup. Her movements were gentle and graceful, and her fair neck looked especially charming in the light. I took a deep breath and said, "Honey, have you been hiding something from me lately?" My wife paused for a moment before continuing with her actions. "No, what could I possibly be hiding from you?" she said, her voice slightly defensive. I looked at her and said seriously, "Don't lie to me. Ever since you met that skeleton pirate first mate, you've been different. Do you have feelings for him?" My wife's body trembled slightly. She put down the cotton pad in her hand and turned her head to look at me, her eyes glistening with tears. "How can you say that to me? I just think he's very mysterious, and besides, he's never hurt us," she said, her voice tinged with a hint of grievance. I looked at her, feeling a little helpless. "But he's a pirate, and his intentions are not pure. You can't be fooled by his sweet talk," I said. But my wife shook her head and said, "You don't know him at all. He's different from the other pirates." I looked at her determined eyes and felt a stab of pain in my heart. From then on, my wife began to frequently find excuses to go near the edge of the deck, and she always pretended to look in the direction of the pirate ship without any intention. And the skeleton pirate first mate seemed to have noticed my wife's attention. He often stood at the bow of the ship and cast meaningful glances at my wife. One day, a heavy fog suddenly appeared on the sea, and visibility became extremely low. The passenger ship had to slow down and navigate carefully through the fog. My wife and I stood on the deck, looking around at the white expanse, a little nervous. Just then, I suddenly heard a faint call, as if it were coming from the fog. "Beautiful lady." The voice was deep and full of magnetism, and it was the voice of the skeleton pirate first mate. My wife's body trembled slightly, and a flash of surprise passed through her eyes. I looked around warily, trying to find the source of the sound. "Don't make a sound. This could be a trap," I whispered to my wife. But my wife didn't seem to hear me. She walked towards the direction the voice came from, her footsteps a little anxious. I was shocked and hurriedly followed her. After walking for a while in the fog, we finally saw the skeleton pirate first mate. He was standing on a small boat, wearing a black cloak, and was faintly visible in the fog. "Why are you here?" my wife asked in a low voice, her voice tinged with a tremor. The skeleton pirate first mate smiled slightly and said, "I just want to see you again, beautiful lady." His eyes were full of tenderness, which made me feel sick. I walked up to her and stood in front of her, saying, "What do you want? You'd better stay away from us." The first mate of the skeleton pirate ship ignored me, however, and kept his eyes on my wife. "Madam, would you like to chat with me?" "I won't hurt you," he said. My wife hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I looked at her and felt a sense of anger and disappointment. "How could you?" I said. But my wife looked at me and said, I just want to have a few words with him. It's not dangerous. I looked at her determined eyes and knew I couldn't stop her. So I stood aside and watched them warily. The skeleton pirate first mate chatted with my wife, and their voices were especially clear in the fog. As I listened to their conversation, my anger grew. The skeleton pirate first mate was telling my wife about his experiences, about his adventures at sea. His wife was listening intently, her eyes full of curiosity and longing. As I watched her, I felt a wave of despair. I didn't know where this strange attraction would lead our marriage. And this encounter in the fog made me realize that the emotional entanglement between my wife and the skeleton pirate first mate had become deeper and deeper, and I was facing an unprecedented challenge. As time passed, the fog gradually dispersed, but the connection between my wife and the skeleton pirate first mate did not end there. After returning to the passenger ship, my wife's face was filled with a kind of radiance that I had never seen before, an excitement born of being attracted to something new. I looked at her, my heart filled with helplessness and pain, but I didn't know how to pull her out of this dangerous emotional whirlpool. That night, I lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Next to me, my wife breathed evenly, seemingly already asleep. I quietly looked at her sleeping face, my heart full of emotions. The once gentle, dependent wife is now attracted to a mysterious skeleton pirate first mate, and our marriage is facing a huge crisis. I know that this emotional battle with the skeleton pirate first mate has only just begun, and the road ahead will be full of thorns and challenges. But I will not give up easily. I must protect our love and bring my wife back to me. But I don't know if I really have what it takes to defeat the mysterious and seductive skeleton pirate first mate, or if I can win my wife's heart back. In this endless darkness, I fell into deep thought, waiting for fate's next arrangement. After the fog lifted, the passenger ship continued to sail slowly on the sea, but the atmosphere on board became more and more delicate. My wife's encounter with the skeleton pirate first mate in the fog was like a stone thrown into a calm lake, sending ripples out in all directions, and making my already uneasy heart even more panicked. Since then, my wife has been looking for all kinds of excuses to come to the deck frequently. She no longer walks hand in hand with me as she used to, but often stands alone by the railing, her gaze beyond the vast ocean towards the skeleton pirate ship that is always there. The fear in her eyes has long since disappeared, replaced by a look of expectation and longing. It is a look I have never seen in her eyes before, and it makes me feel incredibly strange. On this day, the sun shone on the sea, sparkling. My wife had dressed up carefully. She was wearing a red dress, the bright color like a burning flame, setting off her pale skin. The neckline of the dress was slightly open, revealing delicate collarbones and a graceful neckline. Her long hair was braided into an elegant plait, falling over her shoulders, with a few strands fluttering in the wind, adding a touch of charm to her. She was wearing a pair of red high heels, which made a crisp sound with every step she took, echoing across the deck. As I watched her carefully groomed appearance, an ominous feeling welled up in my heart. "Why are you dressed so formally today?" I asked, trying to make my voice sound calm. My wife paused slightly, then gave a faint smile and said, "It's nothing. I just feel that I should dress up properly on the boat." Her eyes twinkled, and she didn't dare to make eye contact with me. We went out onto the deck, and my wife's pace quickened noticeably as she walked straight towards the bow of the ship. I followed silently behind her, my heart full of helplessness. When we reached the bow, I saw the Skull pirate ship sailing not far away. The first mate of the Skull pirate ship stood on the bow, wearing a black cloak. In the sunlight, his figure looked exceptionally tall. He saw his wife and a smile appeared on his face. That smile looked particularly strange on his skull-like face, but it also carried a hint of tenderness. He waved at his wife, and she slightly raised her hand in response. A sharp pain shot through my heart, as if countless needles were pricking me. "Why do you always have to be in contact with him?" I finally couldn't hold back and asked, my voice tinged with anger. My wife turned her head and looked at me, her eyes flashing with impatience. She said, "We were just chatting. Don't be so narrow-minded." After that, she ignored me and continued to look in the direction of the pirate ship. Just then, the skeleton pirate first mate threw a black silk scarf from the ship. The scarf fluttered in the air and slowly landed at the feet of my wife. A flash of surprise passed through my wife's eyes. She bent down to pick up the scarf, stroked it gently, and a look of ecstasy appeared on her face. "He gave this to me. Isn't it beautiful?" she said, her voice tinged with a hint of triumph. I looked at the scarf in her hand, and the anger in my heart could no longer be suppressed. "You throw it away immediately," I shouted, reaching out to grab the scarf from her hand. But my wife quickly hid the scarf behind her back and said, "Don't be so unreasonable. This is his token of affection." I looked at her determined face and felt a wave of despair. From then on, my wife interacted more and more frequently with the first mate of the Skull and Bones. They often communicated with hand signals and glances across the two ships. Sometimes the first mate of the Skull and Bones would throw over small gifts, which my wife always happily accepted as if they were priceless. One time, the passenger ship encountered a storm. The waves were rough, the ship swayed violently, and the passengers were terrified, hiding in their cabins. I took my wife's hand and tried to lead her back to the cabin to hide. But my wife broke free of my hand and said, "I want to go up on deck and take a look." I was shocked and shouted, "Are you crazy? It's so dangerous out there." But my wife didn't listen to me at all. She ignored my attempts to stop her and resolutely ran towards the deck. I had no choice but to follow her. When we reached the deck, the stormy wind and rain came at us, instantly soaking us to the skin. I saw the skeleton pirate ship swaying in the storm, and the skeleton pirate first mate standing at the bow, seemingly searching for something. When he saw his wife, a flash of surprise crossed his eyes. He shouted, "Beautiful lady, are you okay?" His wife also shouted back, "I'm fine, but you have to be careful." Their voices were especially faint in the storm, but they were full of concern. I looked at them and felt a wave of despair. In this storm, I felt like an outsider. While the emotions between my wife and the skeleton pirate first mate quickly heated up in this harsh environment. The storm finally passed, and the passenger ship gradually returned to calm. My wife's face was filled with an excitement she had never felt before, and her eyes were filled with admiration and love for the skeleton pirate first mate. From then on, my wife began to actively keep her distance from me. She no longer shared her thoughts with me, no longer ate with me, and no longer even slept in the same bed with me. She devoted all her time and energy to her flirtatious interactions with the skeleton pirate first mate. At night, I lay alone in bed, looking at the ceiling, my heart filled with pain and helplessness. I thought of the good times we had had, and of our vows and promises. But now it all seemed like a distant memory. I know that the affair between my wife and the skeleton pirate first mate has spread like wild grass, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. One day, I overheard my wife talking to a female passenger in the cabin corridor. "Do you really like that skeleton pirate first mate?" the female passenger asked. My wife was silent for a while, then she said softly, "I don't know. I just think he is very special, and being with him, I can feel a kind of excitement and happiness that I have never felt before." Hearing her words, my heart felt as if it had been torn apart. I finally understood that my wife's heart had been completely taken by that skeleton pirate first mate, and I had lost this emotional battle. But I was unwilling to just give up, and I decided to make one more effort to save our marriage and win back my wife's heart. I found my wife and said to her seriously, "Dear, we used to love each other so much. Do you really want to give up everything for a pirate?" My wife looked at me, a hint of hesitation flashing in her eyes, but soon that hesitation was replaced by determination. "I'm not the person I used to be. I want to pursue my own happiness," she said. I looked at her and felt a wave of despair. I didn't know where this ambiguous relationship would lead us, but I knew that the distance between my wife and I was growing wider and wider, and the skeleton pirate first mate was taking her away from me step by step. During this long sea journey, our fate was heading in an unknown direction, and I could only wait for the end in pain and helplessness. Since that fruitless conversation with my wife, I have been in endless pain and suffering. On this drifting passenger ship, every corner seems to be filled with the sweet memories we once shared. But now I am the only one struggling in the whirlpool of those memories. My wife's attitude towards me has become increasingly indifferent, and it seems that her heart is completely taken up by the skeleton pirate first mate. I, like an abandoned person, have become insignificant in this relationship. As the days passed, the passenger ship was about to arrive at the next port, and the relationship between my wife and the skeleton pirate first mate grew closer in this tense atmosphere. Their communication was no longer limited to glances and gestures, and occasionally they would shout across the ship, in an intimate tone as if they were a couple. That day, the sun shone softly on the deck. I saw my wife standing by the railing once again, looking across the ship at the skeleton pirate first mate. Her face was alight with a smile of happiness that I hadn't seen on it in a long time. A pang of pain shot through my heart, and I slowly walked over to her, trying to make one last effort. "Honey, we'll be arriving at the port soon. Once we disembark, we'll go home. Forget about all this and start over." "Okay," I said softly, my eyes full of hope. My wife turned her head and looked at me. A flash of reluctance crossed her eyes, but it quickly returned to indifference. "I don't want to go back. I want to stay with him." Her voice was soft, but it hit my heart like a sledgehammer. "Do you really want to give up our years of love for a pirate you've never met? We've been through so much together. Can you easily forget those memories?" My voice trembled a little, and my heart was full of unwillingness. A hint of hesitation flashed in my wife's eyes. She lowered her head and said softly, "I know I'm being selfish, but I really can't control my feelings. Being with him, I feel like I'm living again, full of passion and vitality." Just as we were at an impasse, suddenly, a shrill alarm sounded in the distance. It turned out that the Coast Guard had spotted the pirate ship, the skeleton, and was rapidly approaching. The face of the skeleton's first mate instantly turned grave, and he shouted, directing the pirates on board to prepare for battle. My wife's face also turned pale, and a flash of fear crossed her eyes. "What should we do?" "He'll be in danger," she said anxiously, her eyes full of worry. I looked at her and my heart was filled with mixed emotions. On the one hand, I hoped that the pirates would receive the punishment they deserved and end this absurd farce. On the other hand, I felt sorry for my wife and didn't want to see her sad and upset. The pirate ship with the skeleton on the mast began to speed up and escape, while the passenger ship was forced to stop to avoid being drawn into the conflict. My wife stood on the deck, looking at the pirate ship that was getting further and further away, with tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't let anything happen to him, I have to go to him," she suddenly said, and turned to run towards the side of the ship. I was quick and grabbed her. "Are you crazy? You'll only get yourself into danger," I shouted, my heart filled with fear. My wife struggled desperately, her eyes full of determination. "Let me go. I want to be with him, for better or for worse." Her voice cracked with sobs, sounding heartbreaking. I held her tightly and tried to calm her down. "Calm down, you're not making any sense. He's a pirate. What he's doing is illegal, and you'll end up in trouble if you stay with him," I said, my voice tinged with pleading. My wife was unmoved, however, and she continued to struggle with astonishing strength. Just then, the Coast Guard ship had closed in on the pirate ship, and a fierce firefight broke out. The sound of gunfire echoed across the sea, and the smoke filled the air. My wife watched the scene in a daze, her eyes filled with fear and despair. "No, don't hurt him," she muttered, her voice full of helplessness. I looked at her and felt a pang of sadness in my heart. I knew that in her heart, the pirate first mate had already taken an irreplaceable position. As the battle raged on, the skeleton pirate ship gradually found itself at a disadvantage. The pirates began to jump into the sea one after another to escape, while the skeleton pirate first mate stood at the bow of the ship, seemingly putting up a last-ditch resistance. My wife could no longer control her emotions when she saw this scene. She broke free from my embrace and ran towards the side of the ship. "I'm going to go find him. Even if I die, I want to be with him," she shouted. her voice full of determination. I was shocked and hurriedly chased after her. When I arrived at the edge of the ship, I saw that my wife had already climbed onto the railing and was preparing to jump into the sea. "Don't!" I shouted, reaching out to pull her back. But just then, a cannonball hit the Skull pirate ship, and a loud explosion sounded, and the ship began to shake violently. My wife slipped and fell towards the sea. Without hesitation, I jumped into the sea and swam in the direction of my wife's fall. In the cold sea water, I swam as hard as I could and finally grabbed my wife's hand. I held her hand tightly and pulled her out of the water. My wife was crying in my arms, her eyes full of confusion and pain. "What should I do? What should I do?" She kept repeating this sentence, her voice full of helplessness. I held her as we swam back to the passenger ship. By the time we were pulled aboard by the crew, my wife was exhausted. She collapsed onto the deck, her eyes staring blankly into the sky. I sat beside her, also filled with confusion. I didn't know what the future held for us, or if my wife would ever be able to recover from this painful experience. The Coast Guard eventually subdued the Skull pirate ship, and the pirates were captured one by one. The first mate of the Skull pirates was also taken on board the patrol boat. When my wife saw him being escorted past, a flash of pain and reluctance passed through her eyes. "Are you really sure?" I asked softly, my heart full of fear for her answer. My wife was silent for a long time, and then slowly nodded. "I think I still love him, and I can't just watch him leave like this," she said in a soft voice that filled me with despair. I looked at her and felt a pang of sadness in my heart. I knew that I could no longer win her heart back. In this painful choice, she chose the skeleton pirate first mate, and I had to bear the pain alone. The passenger ship continued to sail towards the port, but the distance between my wife and I seemed to grow ever wider. I had no idea what the future held for us, nor how this relationship would end. But I knew that during this long sea voyage, we had both experienced unforgettable pain, and that this pain would probably stay with us for the rest of our lives. The passenger ship slowly sailed towards the port. My wife sat in the corner of the deck, her eyes still staring blankly into the distance. I silently stayed by her side, my heart filled with bitterness. We were once in love, but now we have fallen into this situation. As the ship docked, the Coast Guard escorted the skeleton pirates off the ship one by one, and the crowd occasionally shouted accusations and insults at the pirates. My wife's gaze followed the skeleton pirate first mate being escorted, and her body trembled slightly, her lips turning pale. I looked at her in this state, my heart filled with mixed emotions. I hoped that she would let go of this absurd relationship, but I was also worried that she might do something stupid. Just then, a uniformed patrolman walked up to us. He looked at my wife and then at me and said, "Ma'am, we found some clues related to you during the interrogation. We hope you can cooperate with us for further investigation." My wife's body shook violently, and a flash of panic crossed her eyes. I subconsciously took her hand to comfort her. We followed the patrolman to a temporary interrogation room, which was filled with a depressing atmosphere. The skeleton pirate first mate was handcuffed to a chair. When he saw his wife enter, a strange light flashed in his eyes. "You've finally come, my dear." His voice carried a hint of triumph, a far cry from the gentleness he had shown before on the ship. His wife looked at him, her eyes full of confusion and expectation. "What's wrong with you? They said they had clues about me. What is it?" she asked anxiously. The skeleton pirate first mate sneered and said, "Humph, do you really think I love you? You are just a pawn in my plan." The wife's face instantly turned pale, and she swayed a little, nearly falling. "What are you saying? You're lying to me, aren't you?" Her voice was full of tears, and her eyes were full of despair. The skeleton pirate first mate laughed with satisfaction. "Why would I lie to you? From the beginning, I just wanted to use you. You know what? You have a key clue that can unlock a mysterious treasure. If I get you, I can find that treasure and live a carefree life." Hearing this, the anger in my heart instantly flared up. "You despicable guy! How dare you take advantage of her feelings?" I yelled angrily. The skeleton pirate first mate looked at me without a care in the world. Feelings? On this vast sea, what is the value of feelings? I only want wealth and freedom. My wife's eyes were filled with tears, and her body kept trembling. No, it's not possible. You were so good to me. Were those things all fake? She said chokingly. The skeleton pirate first mate said disdainfully. Of course they were fake. Those sweet nothings were just to keep you obedient. Did you really think I would fall for that stupid woman? My wife's eyes were filled with pain and remorse, and she suddenly rushed over, trying to hit the skeleton pirate first mate. But her strength seemed so weak at this time that before she could touch the first mate, she was stopped by the patrolman. You liar! I hate you! She shouted, her voice full of despair. I walked up to her and embraced my wife tightly in my arms. It's okay. It's all over, I whispered in comfort. My wife burst into tears in my arms, her cries full of grievances and self-blame. I patted her back gently, my heart full of pain for her. The patrolman looked at us and said, Fortunately, we discovered his plot in time. Otherwise, you might have been in even greater danger. I looked at the patrolman gratefully and said, Thank you. Without you, the consequences would have been unimaginable. After leaving the interrogation room, my wife felt as if she had been drained of all her energy. She leaned weakly against me. I'm sorry, I was wrong. I shouldn't have been fooled by his sweet talk, she said with remorse in her voice. I looked at her and said gently, It's okay. As long as you're okay. Let's go home and start over. My wife nodded, and a glimmer of hope returned to her eyes. We walked out of the harbor, the sun shining down on us, warm and bright. After this storm, my wife and I's relationship had also undergone some changes. We were no longer the same as before, but we cherished each other even more. On the way home, my wife held my hand tightly, her eyes full of determination. From now on, I will never leave you again, she said. I looked at her and felt great relief in my heart. After this unexpected turn of events, we both understood that true love can withstand the test of time, while the temptation of false love will eventually be crushed by reality. Back home, we began to reorganize our lives. My wife gradually emerged from that painful experience, becoming stronger and more mature. We reminisced about the good old days together, and those happy memories strengthened our resolve to stay together. One day, while sorting through old things, we found the black rose and black silk scarf that my wife had received on the ship. My wife looked at these things and a complex emotion flashed in her eyes. She gently threw them into the trash can, then turned to me and said with a smile, That's all in the past. Now, I just want to be with you and live a simple but happy life. I looked at her and my heart was full of happiness. After this emotional upheaval, our love had become even stronger. We were convinced that in the future, no matter what difficulties and challenges we encountered, we would be able to face them together and go to the other side of happiness together. And the skeleton pirate first mate was also brought to justice. His greed and cunning ultimately led to him eating the bitter fruit of his own actions and losing his freedom and the wealth he had coveted. Whenever we think of this experience, we are full of emotion. It taught us that true love is priceless in this world, and that those blinded by desire will ultimately pay a heavy price. As the days passed, our lives gradually returned to normal. But that time at sea is forever etched in our memories and has become a special experience in our lives. It has made us grow and made us cherish each other and this hard-won love even more.